I was born with hands that learned the language of work before they learned poetry, and I never apologize for that. The smell of soap boiling on a wood stove is my oldest memory of comfort, not perfume from a fanciful bottle. I measure value by the weight of harvest baskets, not by the shimmer of bracelets that clink for applause. So when my son brought home a bride who loved cameras more than kitchens, I promised myself to be kind. I told my bones to be patient, to let youth be loud, and let wisdom be quiet as rain. But quiet rain can sound like weakness to ears trained only for thunder and spectacle. She looked at my shoes first, plain, cracked, honest as bread, and smiled like a blade. "It's quaint," she said, as if simplicity were a stain to be scrubbed from a family portrait. I folded the smile into my apron pocket and chose not to bleed where the floor could see. Because dignity, my dear, is a candle you guard with two hands when others puff and laugh. The first time she laughed at me, a glass of champagne trembled between her jeweled fingers. The laughter had tiny heels on it, tap, tap, stepping on the softer parts of my heart. She called my dress vintage, the way people label jars they will never open. My son kissed her temple and missed the bruise her words left on mine. I told myself love makes men clumsy, not cruel, and clung to that thread. At dinner, she said my recipes were homey, like furniture destined for the garage. I stirred the stew as if stirring the river of my temper, keeping the banks from overflow. She asked if I knew how to pronounce the wine. I asked if she knew how to pronounce gratitude. The room chuckled, but she tightened her lips, pearls guarding teeth that longed to bite. I kept my eyes on the simmer, because food forgives what pride refuses to swallow. Humility has a spine. Mine learned to stand while carrying pails heavier than gossip. Yet humiliation is different. It crouches low and gnaws in secret places. I heard her on the phone, whispering that I was provincial, charming in a museum way. As if elders were exhibits, and the living were only those with shimmering handbags. She suggested redecorating my kitchen, decluttering the old, like scraping memory off a pan. I ran a finger along the wooden table my late husband built, and it hummed of yesterdays. Not everything aged as rust. Some things aged are roots, and roots hold houses upright. She said, modern kitchens sell homes, and I thought, souls are not for sale. I washed a single cup and listened to the porcelain sing a small, stubborn hymn. There are hymns you hum when the world prefers a louder, emptier music. The day she mocked my hands was the day my patience found its last chair. These hands, she said, tell a story, but maybe it's time for a manicure to rewrite the ending. I wanted to tell her these hands stitched my husband's final shirt with tears for thread. These hands learned numbers at the market and theology in the garden. They blessed bread, buried dreams, and lifted sons from fevers and foolishness. But I only smiled and said, my hands speak a truth polish cannot translate. Her laugh rang like thin metal, bright enough to show, too hollow to hold. She posted a photo, my hands against the old table, captioned, aesthetic rustic vibes. I thought of how poverty becomes a costume for the rich, an experience to borrow and brag about. I wiped the crumbs and kept the dignity. Some truths are safest without applause. I do not tell you this to make a villain of a young woman raised by mirrors. Mirrors can only return what they receive, and her life had taught her to pose, not to kneel. She knew the price of a bag, but not the cost of a night beside the dying. She could list labels, but not the names of flowers that open at dawn like prayers. I watched her love my son the way a collector loves a limited edition. I prayed she would learn to love him the way seasons love a tree, through bare and bloom. When she rolled her eyes at my cardigan, I wrapped it tighter, like a flag of quiet nations. When she sighed at my stories, I folded them, pressed them, and stored them in cedar. There is a time to cast pearls and a time to mend nets. I chose my times carefully. Even so, a tide was gathering, and tides are not moved by etiquette or eye rolls. The secret you're waiting for did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived like dawn, certain, soft, unstoppable. Long before her laughter, there was a document folded beneath a floorboard he himself had laid. A promise written when love was young and money still spoke in whispers. A key tucked where only memory would know to reach, and memory remembers by touch. I had not wanted to use it. I preferred my quiet life to the noise of fortune. But mockery has a way of waking sleeping guardians and calling them to the gate. I touched the floor with the reverence of a widow greeting an old friend. The plank lifted, the paper breathed, and a name rose like a bell from the past. Not hers. Not my son's. Mine. Inked with the kind of love that signs in full, unwavering letters. That was the night I understood. Simplicity is not silence. Sometimes it is the seal on a hidden throne. He was a builder, my late husband, not of palaces or cathedrals, but of quiet, lasting things, beams that whispered safety, tables that held bread, hands that never left mine cold. We met on a rainy morning when my umbrella turned inside out, and he offered his coat, already drenched, without asking my name. His laughter was like thunder softened by distance, strong, but never meant to frighten. He said a home was not made of walls, but of promises stacked straight and kept dry. Together we built ours nail by nail, prayer by prayer, until even the wind knew our address. We didn't have much, yet the little we owned sang of honesty and sweat. He taught me that love is not grand gestures, but the sound of boots by the door every evening. I can still hear that sound in the dark when I can't sleep. And maybe that's why I kept the house exactly as he left it, untouched, sacred, stubborn. A museum of devotion that no redecorator could ever improve. When sickness came for him, it did not knock. It seeped under the door like winter. He coughed more than he spoke, yet each word he managed was a brick of memory. I read to him under the yellow light of our old lamp. He smiled between sentences he no longer followed. One night, his hands searched mine and found them trembling. "Don't let them take what's ours," he whispered. I didn't understand then, thought he spoke of thieves or taxes. Only later would I realize he meant something deeper, buried, sealed beneath our very feet. The night he passed, the rain returned, as if the sky wanted to finish what it started the day we met. I laid his tools on the table and covered them with a cloth, like soldiers dismissed from duty. Even silence had weight that night, pressing on my chest until I forgot how to breathe. But grief is a stubborn tenant. It moves in without asking and rearranges your rooms. Weeks after the funeral, I found his handwriting on an envelope tucked in a drawer. The letters were shaky but clear. "For you, when the laughter gets cruel." I remember staring at it for hours, my tears blurring the ink until the words seemed alive. I wanted to open it, but something inside me said, not yet. It was as if he was still protecting me, saving his voice for the day I'd need it most. So I placed it beneath the floorboard he had once replaced, beside the chest of his old blueprints. He was always practical. He hid love in places logic would never search. That envelope became both a comfort and a curse, humming softly in the dark beneath my feet. I'd stand over it sometimes, as if listening for his heartbeat through the wood. It reminded me that promises, like seeds, bloom only when the season calls. People think legacy is about money, but it isn't. It's about mercy with memory. He built more than furniture. He built me, taught me to stand even when my knees wanted to confess. When the neighbors came to gossip, I smiled and poured tea instead of tears. When bills piled up, I sold trinkets but kept the wedding ring, the only circle that mattered. And when my son grew, I tried to raise him as his father had lived, steady, patient, unafraid of calloused hands. But I didn't teach him one thing, how to see worth beyond polish. That lesson was meant for life to teach, and life is not always gentle in its lessons. So when his wife came with perfume and pretense, I recognized not evil, but emptiness. She reminded me of glass, beautiful, breakable, and always looking for light to steal. I prayed my son would see through it before it shattered around him. There were nights I spoke to my husband in whispers, pretending the wind was his reply. Should I tell them about the document? I'd ask. Or keep it buried where peace still breathes? The house creaked like an old friend thinking before answering. I took that as his silence, and his silence always meant, trust the timing. So I went on living simply, sweeping floors that remembered better days. The smell of wood and lemon oil filled the rooms, reminding me that care leaves its own kind of shine. I often caught my reflection in the window, a face lined not by age, but by endurance. The woman staring back was both widow and watchman of secrets. And though loneliness tried to settle in, I guarded that secret like a mother guards her last lullaby. It wasn't wealth I protected, it was the meaning behind every nail he'd driven into our home. In those years between loss and laughter, I learned something few understand. Silence has a pulse. It waits, it watches, and it remembers. Every sound in that house, the ticking clock, the distant dog, the kettle's sigh, became part of a conversation with ghosts who loved me. I began to feel his presence most when the young mocked my slowness, as if the universe balanced cruelty with whispers of comfort. That hidden document beneath the floor didn't just carry ink, it carried intention, inheritance, identity. It wasn't money alone. It was proof of a life built on truth when the world still believed in it. And I knew, one day, it would surface, not for revenge, but for restoration. For now, I kept the peace, the secret, and the old kettle singing. Because sometimes survival isn't about winning the argument. It's about keeping your soul uncluttered until destiny knocks. And I could already feel it. Destiny was on its way, wearing the shoes of pride and the perfume of my son's wife. The first sign that her world wasn't as perfect as she pretended came quietly, like a dish slipping from soapy fingers. She had returned from a dinner party with mascara trails and a silence too heavy for her usual vanity. I was in the kitchen, folding napkins, when she entered without her usual perfume cloud. Her hands shook as she poured water, the glass tapping against her ring like a metronome of regret. For the first time, she didn't correct me or smirk at my plain apron. She just stood there, eyes fixed on the floor, where humility had been waiting all along. I didn't ask questions. Wisdom has taught me that truth blooms better when left unforced. She mumbled something about appearances and how people love to watch you fall. It wasn't an apology yet, only the faint echo of someone realizing their reflection was cracked. I wanted to comfort her, but pride is a child that must trip before it learns balance. So I stayed silent, letting the air between us carry its quiet sermon. Sometimes, mercy is not in words, it's in restraint. The next morning, my son came home earlier than usual, his jaw tense, his tie undone. He avoided my eyes, which meant there was something he didn't want me to see. When he asked if I had spoken to her, I said yes, but not enough to understand. He sighed, heavy like a man who just learned that love can rot if it's only watered with vanity. I wanted to tell him what his father once said, that a woman who can't kneel in gratitude will one day kneel in loss. But I let the lesson come from life, not from my mouth. Days passed, and the tension in the house became another piece of furniture, always there, pretending not to be. She stopped mocking my cooking and started eating in silence, chewing the taste of consequence. Her friends stopped visiting, and her phone, once a stage for her pride, became an empty screen. I caught her watching me sometimes, maybe wondering how I endured storms without losing my shape. There was no hatred in her eyes now, just confusion, the kind that appears when mirrors stop lying. And for the first time, I felt something unexpected, compassion. I began to leave small gestures, a slice of pie by her tea, a folded towel near the sink. Nothing grand, just kindness spoken in the dialect of deeds. She noticed, though she said nothing, and that silence was worth 1,000 thank yous. I could see she was unraveling from the inside, not from poverty, but from pride starving for humility. One night, she whispered good night before going upstairs, her voice fragile like paper. And I realized maybe this was the sound of pride learning how to bow. But life, my dear, has a way of testing lessons before granting redemption. Her fall had only begun, and the truth I had buried beneath those floorboards was restless. It waited like dawn behind a storm, patient but inevitable. I could feel the past stirring beneath my feet every time I swept the floor. And though I said nothing, the air around us was already thick with the scent of revelation. What she mocked in me would soon become the very thing she'd begged to understand. It began with a sound I knew too well, the groan of wood shifting under weight, like a memory stretching its limbs. Every creak in that old house was familiar, but that night, the sound was different, urgent, almost alive. I had been sweeping near the kitchen table when the plank above the hidden envelope murmured faintly. For years, I'd stepped over it as though silence could keep secrets safe. But now, something in the air pressed against my ribs, a call older than fear, softer than reason. It felt as if the house itself had decided it was time to speak. I froze, broom in hand, my heart drumming like a second clock in the room. The wind outside rattled the window pane, echoing a restlessness I couldn't name. I glanced toward the stairs, half expecting her or my son to appear, but the house remained still. It was just me and the whisper rising from beneath my feet. That sound, faint but insistent, pulled at me the way my husband's voice once did when he said, "Trust the timing." And I understood then. The timing had finally arrived. I knelt down, fingers brushing the edge of the plank as if greeting an old friend. The wood was worn smooth, carrying years of footsteps, arguments, and Sunday prayers. It resisted at first. Secrets never surrender easily. When it finally gave way, dust rose like ghosts stretching awake from slumber. There it was, the envelope, yellowed and trembling in my hands, as though it remembered why it existed. Its weight was small, but its meaning pressed against my chest like destiny itself. I didn't open it yet. I couldn't. The letter wasn't just paper, it was a bridge between past and present. My husband's handwriting curled across it like vines, fragile but unbroken. I ran my thumb along the edges, tracing the years we'd shared, the promises we'd buried with hope. He had written those words for a moment like this, I knew, a moment when truth would demand to be seen. But I hesitated, not from fear of the secret, but from compassion for those who would be shattered by it. Sometimes truth isn't heavy because it's wrong, it's heavy because it's right. The wind outside grew louder, as if applauding the courage I had almost found. I tucked the envelope back beneath the plank, just for one more night. The storm could wait until morning. I needed to gather my heart first. As I rose, the chandelier flickered, and for a second, I could have sworn I smelled his cologne. It was as though his spirit stood behind me, hand on my shoulder, saying without words, "You'll know when." I whispered back, "I do now." That night, sleep refused to visit. I lay in bed listening to the rain hammering the roof. Each drop sounded like a clock tick, each gust like a sigh from the walls. Downstairs, beneath that floorboard, the past breathed, patient, poised, inevitable. I knew that once opened, nothing would ever return to the quiet that came before. Secrets, once awakened, don't go back to sleep. And by dawn, I would no longer be the woman mocked for her simplicity. I would be the keeper of a reckoning. Dawn came slowly, tiptoeing through the curtains like a hesitant visitor. I had barely slept, my body still listening to the whispers beneath the floor. The air smelled of wet earth and old coffee, scents that have accompanied every turning point of my life. I walked barefoot through the house, the boards cool and damp under my feet. Each step felt heavier, as if the truth below was magnetizing me toward it. When I reached the kitchen, the silence greeted me like an accomplice. I moved the table aside and knelt once more, my hands trembling but certain. The plank lifted easier this time, as though it too had made peace with what was about to happen. The envelope waited, patient and faithful, like a promise kept in the dark. I held it to my chest for a long moment before breaking the seal. The paper crackled softly, releasing the faint scent of cedar and thyme. And then his handwriting appeared, steady, kind, eternal. "My love," it began, "if you are reading this, it means the world has tested you again." My eyes blurred before I could read further. Even his words carried the warmth of his hands. He wrote of how he feared our son might one day lose his way chasing comfort over character. He warned me that wealth changes people faster than love can teach them truth. But then came the line that stole my breath. "Everything I built, the land, the deeds, the savings, remains under your name, not theirs." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me as I read it twice, then once more in disbelief. He had hidden everything in plain sight, protecting me from both pity and pride. Every hammer strike, every late night at the workbench, all of it had been for love disguised as preparation. I realized then that I was not poor as she believed, only humble by choice. The simplicity she mocked had been my disguise, my shield from greed. My husband had foreseen the cruelty of vanity long before it entered our home. And I, unknowingly, had been sitting atop an inheritance greater than gold, dignity wrapped in foresight. Tears blurred the ink until it looked like it was raining on the page again. I could almost hear his voice, telling me that patience always pays its debts in full. The letter ended with one sentence that still echoes in me. When the laughter becomes too loud, let the truth do the talking. I folded the paper carefully, kissed it, and placed it back in the envelope. But this time, I didn't hide it. I left it on the table, waiting for fate to notice. When the morning sun touched that letter, it glittered faintly, like it knew it had work to do. I poured myself tea and watched the steam rise, the same way destiny was about to rise in this house. I didn't know how or when the revelation would come, only that it would come perfectly on time. The universe has a way of choreographing justice in silence. And as the kettle sang, I whispered to the empty room, "Let the truth be seen." The day had begun, and with it, so had the unraveling of lies. It was a Sunday morning, the kind that smells like forgiveness and dust. The house was quiet, but not peaceful, the kind of silence that hums before a storm. I had left the letter on the table, face down, pretending it was nothing more than paper. But destiny, like a curious child, always finds what it's not meant to touch. She came into the kitchen wearing her usual perfume of superiority and impatience. Her eyes landed on the envelope as if drawn by some invisible string. She asked what it was, and I said softly, "A memory." She smiled that half-smile people wear when they think they're 2 steps ahead. Without permission, she reached for it, manicured fingers meeting the handwriting of a better man. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and the color drained from her face. Her lips parted, but the words refused to come out. Pride had lost its script. The room, usually her stage, turned into her mirror, showing her everything she wasn't. She set the letter down like it burned, whispering, "This can't be right." Her voice trembled, not from disbelief, but from recognition of truth too big to deny. I didn't gloat or smile. Vengeance has never been my language. I only looked at her, calm as the earth after rain. "All this time," she said, "you lived like this didn't exist?" And I answered, "Because some wealth belongs to silence, not to show." My son entered then, drawn by voices that carried too much meaning. He saw the letter, saw her face, then saw me, and knew before a word was spoken. He took the paper gently, reading it twice, as if hoping the ink might change. But truth doesn't rewrite itself for comfort. He turned to me with eyes that suddenly remembered where they came from. "Why didn't you tell me, Mother?" he asked. I smiled, not with triumph, but with the relief of a long-kept promise fulfilled. "Because love doesn't need to prove itself rich," I said. "She needed to learn what I could never teach with words." He looked at his wife, the woman who had once mocked my plain shoes, now barefoot in realization. For a long while, no one spoke. The walls, the clock, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And in that silence, pride finally bowed. When she left the kitchen, she didn't look at me, not out of anger, but shame. My son followed, his steps heavy with the weight of rediscovery. I stayed behind, tracing the outline of the letter on the table. My husband's words had done what my voice never could. Through ink and faith, he had restored balance to a house that had forgotten its foundation. And somewhere beyond that morning light, I swear I heard his laughter, proud, peaceful, and free. The days that followed felt like autumn, calm, golden, and heavy with quiet change. The house that once echoed with vanity now whispered lessons between its walls. Even the sunlight seemed softer, filtering through the curtains like an apology. My son spoke less, but when he did, His words carried the gravity of a man reborn. He helped me with the garden again, his hands finally remembering their father's rhythm. And I could tell the house had begun to remember love. She moved through the rooms differently now, slower, almost reverent. The same woman who once dismissed my old dishes now washed them with care. She lingered longer at the table where the letter had rested, tracing invisible words. Once, I caught her standing by the window, eyes glistening as she watched the rain. There was no more laughter, no sharpness, only the fragile stillness of reflection. It was as if the truth had polished her soul the way time polishes stone. I didn't gloat or remind her of her cruelty. Wisdom knows that shame teaches faster than scolding. Instead, I began to tell her stories about my husband, about how he loved without boasting. She listened, her hands folded neatly, the way one prays without realizing it. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "He sounds like the kind of man I wish I had met." I smiled softly. "You did," I said, "through the lessons his love left behind." Her eyes filled, and she nodded, the first honest gesture she'd ever given me. Little by little, she began to rebuild the bridge she had burned. She helped in the kitchen, her laughter no longer cruel but nervous, human. We cooked side by side, silence between us no longer heavy but healing. Once, she asked me to teach her my bread recipe, the same one she once called old-fashioned. As she kneaded the dough, I saw in her eyes something I hadn't seen before, humility. And in that moment, I realized redemption doesn't arrive loud. It arrives hungry and sincere. My son watched from the doorway, his gaze softening every time he saw us together. He would bring flowers from the market, leaving them without a word on the table. There was a peace in him that I hadn't seen since he was a boy chasing butterflies. We began to eat together again, not out of habit but out of heart. The food tasted the same, but something invisible had changed, perhaps the seasoning of forgiveness. Even the chairs seemed to creak with gratitude. One evening, as the sun melted into gold, she touched my arm and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't for the bread or the stories. It was for the mercy I hadn't withdrawn. I looked at her and said, "We all mock what we don't understand. You just learn to see." Her eyes lowered, and I knew pride had finally laid down its sword. The house felt lighter that night, as if every corner had exhaled. And for the first time in years, I slept without the sound of ghosts. Only peace. Gratitude has a voice, though most people never stop long enough to hear it. It speaks in the small pauses between chores, in the warmth of shared silence. Every morning, I woke to the sound of dishes gently clinking, her way of saying thank you without words. The same woman who once mocked my simplicity now folded napkins with reverence. There was something almost sacred in her quiet service, like a penance offered to the unseen. And though I never mentioned it, I heard her heart louder than her hands. My son seemed lighter too, as if he had been released from the tension of divided loyalties. He smiled more, spoke slower, and often reached for her hand when he thought I wasn't watching. Their arguments had been replaced by conversations, not perfect ones, but real ones. I noticed her listening now, not waiting to answer, but waiting to understand. Sometimes I'd find them both in the garden, laughing softly at the stubborn weeds. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years. Laughter without cruelty. One afternoon, she came to me with a small box wrapped in plain paper. "I made this for you," she said, her eyes uncertain, as though afraid I might refuse. Inside was a necklace, not expensive, but made of beads she'd strung herself. "I know it's not much," she added, "but I wanted you to have something from my hands." For a moment, I saw the young woman she could have been if not blinded by pride. I placed it around my neck, feeling its warmth. Forgiveness has its own kind of shine. We began sharing more time together, cooking, tending the flowers, even watching the rain. Each gesture was small, but small things rebuild what grand words destroy. I realized that kindness, once sown, grows quietly until it covers everything. Even the house itself seemed to hum with softer energy, the walls remembering laughter without venom. There was peace again, not the peace of silence, but the peace of hearts finally speaking truth. And in that harmony, I felt my husband's presence like sunlight through a window pane. But healing never walks alone. It brings with it the test of sincerity. One evening, I overheard her on the phone, speaking to someone from her old world. Her tone was different now, humble, almost apologetic. She spoke of how she had misjudged what real wealth meant. Her voice cracked when she said, "I live with the richest woman I know, and she doesn't even act like it." I smiled quietly, not out of pride, but relief. The lesson had taken root. That night, I stood in the doorway, watching her and my son reading together. The letter still rested in the drawer, no longer a weapon but a witness. I realized then that the true inheritance wasn't what was written on paper. It was the transformation unfolding before me, the redemption money could never buy. Gratitude had echoed through this house, erasing the sharp edges left by arrogance. And I knew that somewhere beyond the veil, my husband was smiling too. Peace has a strange way of attracting storms, as if the universe tests our calm to see if it's real. That morning began like any other, coffee steaming, birds arguing in the trees. Then a car I didn't recognize stopped at the gate, shining like arrogance on wheels. She looked out the window and froze, her color draining like ink in rain. "It's my sister," she whispered, and I understood. Ghosts always know how to find the living. The air thickened, carrying the scent of old pride returning for one last performance. Her sister entered the house, as if inspecting a stage rather than visiting a home. Every step she took echoed judgment, eyes scanning furniture, walls, even me. She carried herself like a mirror that only reflects what flatters the viewer. They hugged briefly, but it felt rehearsed, like a courtesy learned from magazines. The sister's smile was sweetened poison, and her words dripped with envy disguised as charm. "So, this is where you've been hiding," she said, looking around with deliberate disdain. I watched the scene unfold without speaking, like a witness at a silent trial. The sister made little jokes about simple living, glancing at my apron as if it were comedy. But I saw her hands, restless, adorned with expensive rings that couldn't hide emptiness. My daughter-in-law tried to defend our home, her voice unsteady but sincere. "This place taught me peace," she said, surprising even herself with the truth. The sister laughed, a brittle sound that couldn't find warmth in its own echo. I stepped forward then, gently, like a breeze opening a curtain. "Welcome," I said, offering tea the way one offers a truce. She hesitated, perhaps not used to kindness that expected nothing in return. As we sat, I could see the old tension in my daughter-in-law's shoulders. Her pride was wrestling her past, and losing beautifully. The sister kept talking, but the room no longer obeyed her energy. When the tea cooled, silence filled the spaces between words. Finally, the sister leaned back and said, "I don't know how you stand this life." My daughter-in-law looked at her and smiled, the kind of smile born from truth, not vanity. "Because it's not a life you stand," she said softly. "It's a life you live." Her sister blinked, unsure how to answer wisdom she didn't expect. And for the first time, I saw pride bow before grace, not mine, but hers. When the visitor left, the air in the house felt lighter, as if it had shed old perfume. My daughter-in-law turned to me, eyes bright with both exhaustion and pride of a new kind. "I didn't let her shame me this time," she said, almost like a child reporting good news. I placed a hand on her cheek and whispered, "You didn't just defend this house, you defended yourself." She smiled, tears glimmering like morning dew on the edges of her strength. That was the day I realized redemption doesn't end in silence. It speaks through courage reborn. It happened on a Thursday evening, the kind of dusk that glows too peacefully to be trusted. The sky was bruised purple, the air thick with the scent of rain that never came. I was folding laundry when I smelled it, faint at first, then undeniable. Smoke. I ran to the back door, my heart stumbling as flames licked the edge of the garden. The flowers my husband and I had planted together were burning, their beauty devoured by orange hunger. My son shouted from the porch, already hauling buckets of water, barefoot and desperate. She followed, breathless, eyes wide with disbelief and guilt. She had left a candle too close to the curtains in the shed. The fire spread fast, dancing through the vines like gossip through small towns. Neighbors arrived, faces pale under the trembling light of destruction. The sound was a wild symphony, crackling wood, shouted names, and the hiss of water against rage. It felt like the earth was purging something we had all buried too deep. I joined the effort, old hands steady despite the chaos. The heat pressed against my face, fierce and merciless, but I did not back away. I remembered my husband's words, "We protect what protects us." So I fought, not just the fire, but the ghosts it had awakened, fear, regret, and the weight of every silence kept too long. When the last flame hissed into smoke, only ash and steam remained. The air smelled of endings, and beginnings trying to breathe. She collapsed beside the well, tears streaking through soot on her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she cried, voice trembling like glass about to break. This was his garden. I destroyed it. I knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder, feeling her body shake with remorse. "Gardens burn," I said softly, "but roots remember where to grow again." She looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as an obstacle, but as a guide. My son joined us, exhausted, clothes soaked and hands blistered. He looked at her, then at me, and something unspoken passed between us. Forgiveness, maybe even unity. The three of us sat there in silence, the night wind carrying away the smoke like old pain. The stars appeared slowly, timid after the chaos, each one a reminder that beauty always returns. The fire had taken flowers, yes, but it had also burned the last of our pride. And in the ashes, I felt something holy, the rebirth of a family. The next morning, I went outside with my broom, sweeping what the night had left behind. The soil was black, but alive, rich with the memory of flame and the promise of renewal. She joined me quietly, no makeup, no jewelry, only truth in her eyes. We planted new seeds together, our hands dirty, our hearts clean. The wind carried the scent of ash and hope, a strange but beautiful perfume. And I thought, perhaps even fire can be God's way of planting light. The garden looked like a battlefield the next morning, silent except for the whisper of wind over ash. Every color had been erased, replaced by gray and black, the palette of humility. I stood barefoot on the soil, feeling the warmth still trapped beneath the earth. It wasn't destruction I felt, it was cleansing. Sometimes the world burns only what refuses to change. And as I breathed in the smoky air, I realized we had all been part of that fire. She came out holding 2 mugs of tea, her hands still trembling from the night before. No words were needed. Remorse already spoke through her every gesture. We sipped in silence, the steam rising between us like a fragile bridge. Her eyes followed the ruined garden, and I saw the guilt shimmering in them. "I'll help you replant everything," she said softly, like a promise to her own soul. I nodded, because forgiveness doesn't need speeches, just soil and willingness. My son joined us, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, grounding her in quiet strength. He looked at me with gratitude that didn't require translation. The boy who once ignored wisdom had finally learned it through love and loss. "Dad would have been proud," he said, staring at the blackened earth. I smiled faintly, because I could almost hear my husband's laughter riding on the wind. It was the sound of peace earned through trial, a melody you can only hear after surviving flames. Days turned into weeks, and new green began to push through the ashes. Tiny shoots, delicate but determined, reclaiming their place under the sun. She tended to them every morning, whispering softly as if apologizing to each one. Watching her kneel in the dirt became my favorite sight, pride bowing to life. There was something almost holy in it, the way repentance looks when it becomes devotion. The ashes, once symbols of failure, had become the soil of rebirth. I often caught her humming old tunes while she worked, the same songs I used to sing long ago. Her voice was softer now, not seeking attention but harmony. Sometimes she'd bring flowers into the kitchen, simple daisies, humble as truth. She'd place them in a chipped vase, and somehow it looked perfect that way. We started sharing laughter again, the kind that doesn't sting when it fades. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath in reverence for the quiet joy returning home. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, she turned to me and said, "I used to think wealth was about what you owned. Now I see it's about what you can rebuild." I looked at her, hair messy, hands dirty, heart finally open, and saw a new woman. "You've found the secret," I said. "Not everything worth having shines." She smiled, and I felt my husband's spirit settle contentedly between us. The garden wasn't the only thing that had bloomed. She had too. It was early afternoon when I heard the knock, 3 steady taps, polite but deliberate. The kind of knock that carries history, not curiosity. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door to find a man in a dark suit, hat in hand. He introduced himself as a lawyer from the city, his voice formal, his eyes kind. He said he represented an old business partner of my late husband. And with those words, I felt the ghosts of the past stir gently in the corners of the house. My son joined us, his expression wary, protective. The man handed me a small envelope, thinner than the last, but just as heavy in meaning. Inside was a letter from my husband's partner, confirming the final settlement of land and shares. It seemed my husband's foresight had extended even beyond the grave. The document officially declared me the sole owner of assets long forgotten by everyone but him. I looked at the signature, my heart tightening with gratitude and ache intertwined. The lawyer asked if I wished to sell any of it, offering polite financial advice. But I shook my head. This was never about wealth. It was about intention. "Please tell him," I said softly, "that the house he helped build still stands, stronger than before." The man nodded, though his eyes showed confusion. He didn't understand I was speaking to the past, not to him. My son read the papers twice, his fingers tracing the ink like it were holy scripture. I could see realization dawning in him, the magnitude of what we'd almost lost. When she came into the room, her eyes widened at the sight of the documents. She stood quietly behind my son, no trace of envy this time, only humility. "I don't want to know the numbers," she said softly, surprising us all. "I just want to help you use it for something good." Her words struck me deeper than the inheritance itself. It was proof that her transformation had roots, not just blossoms. We decided to invite the lawyer for tea before he left, a gesture of gratitude rather than transaction. As we sat at the old wooden table, he looked around and said, "This place is spirit." I smiled. He didn't know how true that was. Spirit was the foundation of this house, built into every nail, every prayer. When he finally left, the air felt charged, as if destiny had dropped one final gift and bowed out quietly. The door closed softly behind him, sealing a new chapter in peace. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, the moonlight brushing across the letter. So much had changed, not just in fortune, but in the fabric of our hearts. The wealth that once slept beneath the floor now lived in forgiveness, in unity, in understanding. I whispered into the night, "We did it, my love. We kept our promise." And for a moment, I felt a warmth pass through the room, his presence, proud and at rest. Outside, the garden shimmered under the moon, alive again, proof that love never truly leaves. Good news travels faster than truth, and by the end of that week, whispers had already begun. Neighbors who once ignored us now appeared at the gate with smiles too wide to trust. People have a strange instinct for scenting fortune, as if greed carries its own perfume. They asked innocent questions, but their eyes betrayed calculation. "Such a blessing for your family," they said, meaning, "such an opportunity for us." I smiled politely, guarding my peace the way one guards a flickering candle in the wind. My son received calls from distant relatives who hadn't spoken to him in years. Each conversation began with nostalgia and ended with suggestion. He listened kindly, but I could see the old pressure building behind his calm eyes. Wealth, I've learned, doesn't change people, it reveals them. And for the first time, I saw in him the same dilemma his father once faced: generosity versus wisdom. A good heart can be a dangerous thing when money enters the room. She, too, felt the change in the air. Old friends began messaging, offering fake warmth. Some invited her to events she had once begged to attend. Now they begged her presence. I watched her handle it with grace I never expected: quiet, firm, unshaken. I used to crave their approval, she told me, but now it feels like poison. I nodded. That's because you've tasted truth, and it ruins the appetite for lies. She smiled faintly, as if realizing how far she'd come from the woman she once was. One evening, my son asked if we should donate part of the inheritance. His words carried both duty and doubt, as though afraid of doing it wrong. I told him, charity begins where pride ends. Don't give to prove you're good. Give because you already are. He nodded, silent for a long time, staring at his hands that finally resembled his father's. The next day, he set aside a portion for the church, the orphanage, and the town's clinic. He did it quietly, without announcements or applause, the purest way to give. Still, not everyone was pleased. Envy has a way of disguising itself as concern. Rumors spread that we had more than we deserved, that we were hoarding wealth. I laughed softly when I heard them. Such noise cannot touch a heart anchored in peace. She grew protective, worried for me, for us, but I told her not to fear. The same tongues that mocked us for having nothing now envy us for having enough. Either way, their hearts remain empty. That's punishment enough. That night, as rain kissed the windows, I prayed in gratitude rather than defense. Our family had been tested by fire, pride, and now by fortune, and we had survived each trial. Money, I realized, wasn't a curse or a blessing. It was merely a mirror. And what it showed us was not greed, but grace. We had learned to be rich in the right things: patience, forgiveness, truth. And that, I thought, was the inheritance my husband truly intended all along. It was late afternoon when the past came knocking again, not in memory, but in flesh and bone. A frail man stood at the gate, clothes worn, hat pressed nervously between his fingers. His face was lined with time, yet his eyes carried a guilt that hadn't aged at all. When he spoke my husband's name, my breath caught in my throat like it had been waiting years for that sound. He introduced himself as Elias, an old partner from the days when survival was more dream than certainty. And just like that, the air thickened with unspoken history. We invited him in, offering tea, the universal gesture of forgiveness before words. He hesitated before sitting, glancing around the house as if measuring ghosts. "I owe your husband more than I can ever repay," he said finally, voice trembling with the weight of decades. He told us how my husband had once lent him money to save his family's farm, without ever asking it back. But shame, he said, doesn't dissolve with time. It ferments until it demands confession. And now, he had come to pay a debt long forgotten by everyone but his conscience. He reached into his coat and placed a small, rusted tin box on the table. Inside were a few gold coins, wrapped in old newspaper and hope. It wasn't much, not compared to what we now possessed, but the gesture carried sacred gravity. "I've lived with this weight my whole life," he whispered, eyes wet with regret. I couldn't rest until I made things right. For a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if honoring the honesty before us. My son tried to refuse, saying it wasn't necessary, but I raised my hand gently. "Let him finish what his soul began," I said. Sometimes redemption needs witnesses as much as it needs courage. Elias exhaled, his shoulders lowering as though he'd been carrying a mountain for 40 years. When he finally looked up, I saw peace glimmering behind his tears. "I can die lighter now," he murmured, smiling for the first time. I took his hands, rough, cracked, and trembling, and held them like an old prayer rediscovered. "You don't owe us," I said. "You honored him by living with remembrance." He nodded, then pressed the tin box toward me one last time. "Then use it for someone who needs mercy," he said softly. That's what he would have done. My heart swelled, not for the money, but for the echo of my husband's kindness returning home. When Elias left, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. Forgiveness had already found him. That night, I placed the tin box on the mantel beside my husband's photograph. The candlelight flickered over their faces, one captured in stillness, the other alive in memory. I realized then that debts of the heart never truly vanish. They simply wait for courage to collect them. And sometimes, repayment comes not in gold, but in grace. The world had brought another soul to our doorstep to remind us why love outlasts all currencies. As I blew out the candle, I whispered, "He paid it, my love, in full, with honor." The next morning, the house felt different, lighter, as if kindness had opened all the windows overnight. The tin box still sat on the mantel, gleaming softly beneath the first touch of sunlight. I stared at it for a long while, wondering what my husband would have done with it. Money, no matter how small, carries intention like a seed carries a tree. It waits for the right heart to plant it in the right soil. And I knew exactly where that seed belonged. Our village had a small school, the same one where my son learned his first letters. The roof leaked when it rained, and the children sat on chairs with splintered edges. The teacher, a kind widow, often used her own wages to keep it running. I had promised myself long ago that one day I would help her, but life had its delays. Now, perhaps, the time had come to fulfill that silent vow. I felt my husband's spirit smile somewhere between memory and mourning. I gathered my son and his wife at the table, the same table that had heard laughter and sorrow alike. "We're going to fix the school," I said simply. They looked at me, surprised but not confused. They knew this was exactly what he would have wanted. We decided to use part of the inheritance and Elias's coins to rebuild it completely. No plaques, no public recognition, just quiet goodness. Because charity whispered is louder in heaven than generosity shouted on earth. When the workers arrived, the village gathered, curious and grateful. Children peeked through the fence, eyes wide as dreams being built brick by brick. She took charge of organizing supplies, her hands steady with newfound purpose. My son worked beside the laborers, sweating without complaint. And as I watched them, I thought, wealth doesn't spoil hearts, distance from compassion does. Here, among dust and laughter, we were finally home again. The day the school reopened, sunlight poured through the new windows like grace finding its way in. The children's laughter rang through the air, brighter than any music. She stood beside me, tears glistening in her eyes as the teacher thanked us. But we both knew who the thanks belonged to, a man no longer living but still giving. His spirit lived through our hands, through every nail and beam raised in his name. It was as though the village itself had learned to breathe gratitude again. That night, when the stars came out, I walked to the garden and looked up at the sky. The wind carried the scent of soil and sawdust, of endings and beginnings mingling perfectly. I whispered, "We did it, my love. The seeds you planted are feeding souls now." For the first time in years, the air around me felt whole, complete. I realized then that legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what continues to grow after you're gone. And in that moment, I knew the true inheritance had finally been spent wisely. The school stood proudly under the morning sun, its new paint still carrying the scent of hope. Children ran through the courtyard with laughter that could have raised the dead to joy. It had been months since the reconstruction, but that day felt special, as if time itself paused to applaud. The teacher had invited us to a small gathering, though she said it was nothing formal. Still, I sensed something brewing beneath her humble tone. Gratitude always carries surprise. So I wore my best dress, the one my husband once said made me look like sunrise. When we arrived, the children were lined up by the gate, each holding a flower. Their faces beamed with innocence, untouched by envy or greed. The teacher smiled, her eyes shimmering with emotion that words couldn't contain. She took my hand and led me to the front of the new building. Then she pointed to a small wooden sign above the door, freshly carved, beautifully simple. It read, "The Samuel Hayes School of Honest Hands." My husband's name. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world around me blurred, shimmering through tears. I traced the letters with trembling fingers, each curve familiar, carved from memory itself. The crowd clapped softly, as if even applause should whisper in reverence. I looked at my son, who stood tall and proud, and at her, eyes glistening, heart open. He smiled and said, "Now they'll all know what kind of man he was." And I answered, "They'll learn what kind of love built this village." The ceremony was simple but pure. Children recited poems, and the teacher spoke with a quivering voice. She told stories of how my husband had fixed their roof during a storm decades ago, how he'd given his tools to anyone who needed them and asked for nothing in return. Each memory felt like a spark reigniting in the crowd's hearts. Even those who once whispered jealousy bowed their heads in quiet respect. And I felt peace wash through me like sunlight through rain. Later that day, I found her, my daughter-in-law, sitting near the garden, holding one of the school's flowers. She looked at me and said, "He's everywhere now, isn't he?" I nodded. "Yes. Because good men never truly leave. They simply change their address." She laughed softly, tears slipping down her cheeks like blessings set free. "I hope I can be worthy of his name too," she whispered. And for the first time, I called her daughter. Not by marriage, but by heart. That night, I placed the program from the ceremony beside his photo. The candle flickered, reflecting both our faces, one remembered, one living. I realized that love multiplies even after loss. It doesn't fade, it transforms. The school would teach children letters, yes, but also lessons about integrity and kindness. And every hammer, every nail, every brick now carried his story. The day the village remembered his name was the day my soul finally rested. The night after the ceremony, I couldn't sleep. Joy has its own restlessness. It keeps the soul awake in gratitude. The house was silent, bathed in moonlight soft enough to remember by. I wandered through the rooms like a pilgrim retracing the steps of her faith. Every corner whispered echoes of him. The chair he fixed, the table he carved, the walls that still knew his touch. When I reached his old desk, I felt that same familiar pull in my chest. Something inside the drawer seemed to hum with unfinished business. The drawer resisted, its wood swollen by time, but my hands were patient. Inside, beneath old bills and faded notes, I found a folded piece of parchment I'd never seen before. The edges were yellowed, but the ink was steady, his handwriting unmistakable. My heart trembled. I sat down before opening it, afraid of what truth might still be waiting. It began simply, "For when you've done everything right and still feel something missing." I smiled through tears. He always knew the moments I hadn't reached yet. He wrote about the nature of love, not as romance, but as endurance. He said, "You are the quiet strength in every loud storm I faced." And then, softer, "If you ever feel the world forgets me, remember, I live wherever kindness is done in my name." I pressed the paper to my chest, feeling the ink merge with my heartbeat. Each word was a bridge between his heaven and my earth. I hadn't realized how much I still needed his voice until it spoke again through time. At the bottom, he had left a final paragraph, brief, but it struck like thunder wrapped in silk. "When the garden blooms again, plant one tree for me. Don't put my name on it. Just let it stand." I cried then, the way the sea cries when it meets the shore, endlessly, gratefully, free. He didn't want monuments. He wanted life to keep moving, growing, forgiving. That was his legacy, not the house, not the land, not the wealth. It was this, the quiet continuation of love. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the first one, side by side, like hands reunited. Then I went to the garden, still damp from the night rain, and chose a place by the new flowers. At dawn, I planted a sapling, small, fragile, yet full of stubborn green. As I covered its roots with earth, I whispered, "Grow like our love, deep, silent, unending." The birds began to sing, as if blessing the ceremony of one heart and two worlds. The wind moved through the branches, carrying his name without needing to say it. When I stood up, my knees ached, but my spirit felt young again. The house glowed faintly in the early light, no longer haunted but hallowed. Inside, the family slept, safe under the roof he built with more than nails. And I knew that tree would grow strong, not because of the soil, but because of the story beneath it. I walked back inside, leaving footprints shaped like closure. The letter had done what life never finished. It gave me peace that words alone could not. Years slipped by softly, like pages turning in a book I no longer rushed to finish. The garden had changed again, greener, fuller, wiser. The tree I planted grew tall and graceful, its branches stretching like arms remembering an embrace. Children from the village often played beneath it, laughing as if joy itself had roots there. Every spring, it bloomed with small white flowers that fell like blessings on the soil. And each petal reminded me that love never disappears, it only changes its address. My son and his wife took over most of the daily work, freeing me to simply watch life unfold. They treated the house not as property, but as a living being that breathed with us. The sound of their laughter filled the rooms where sorrow once lingered. Sometimes she would bring me tea and sit quietly by my side, no longer out of guilt, but genuine care. We spoke of simple things, the weather, the garden, the school. But under every word, gratitude hummed like a soft, endless hymn. The village thrived too. The school grew larger, its walls covered with drawings and dreams. Children now learned about kindness the same way they learned about numbers, as something vital. Every harvest season, families gathered there to celebrate what we had built together. They brought bread, fruit, and stories, and I could feel my husband's spirit among them. Sometimes I would catch someone touching the school sign, whispering his name like a prayer. It made me realize that immortality doesn't belong to gods. It belongs to the good. The tree became a meeting place for everyone, lovers, dreamers, those seeking silence. Its shade healed arguments and hosted proposals. Birds nested in its branches, and I liked to imagine one of them carried his soul, always watching. When people asked about it, I never told them the story. I just smiled. Some things are too sacred to explain. They must simply be felt. And everyone who stood beneath it seemed to understand without words. My body aged, but my heart grew young again, as if time reversed in gratitude. Every wrinkle became a line of poetry, every scar a verse of endurance. I no longer feared death. I had seen what love could build beyond it. Sometimes, at dusk, I'd sit by the window and listen to the world breathing in harmony. The house, the tree, the school, all beating in the same rhythm of remembrance. Peace wasn't a visitor anymore. It had become a permanent resident. One evening, as the sun melted into gold behind the hills, she placed her hand over mine. "Everything you taught me," she said, "is what I'll teach my children one day." Her voice trembled, not from sadness, but from reverence. I smiled, feeling my husband in that moment, proud, unseen, but near. "The world will keep changing," I told her, "but kindness never goes out of season." And in her eyes, I saw the continuation of everything we had built, blooming, eternal. I began to feel it slowly, the body softening, the steps shortening, the nights stretching longer than the days. It wasn't sadness that came with it, but a deep, tranquil knowing. I had lived enough to understand that endings are not punishments, they are appointments with peace. The air around me felt gentler, as if even the wind wished not to startle my calm. The tree outside had grown tall enough to brush the sky, and I thought, perhaps that's how heaven leans close. Each leaf shimmered like a memory saying, "We're still here." I started writing letters, small ones, folded neatly, and hidden in places they'd find later. One for my son, thanking him for carrying love with dignity, not display. One for her, reminding her that humility, once found, must be protected daily. And one for the village, blessing them for keeping kindness alive in their ordinary days. It wasn't wealth I wanted to leave behind. It was wisdom made tender through time. The kind of inheritance that can't be spent, only shared. My health waned, but my spirit grew stronger, anchored by purpose and memory. She refused to leave my side, bringing tea, reading softly, humming lullabies I had once sung to her. In those moments, I realized she had become the daughter I'd always prayed for, not by blood, but by grace. One night, she held my hand and whispered, "You've done enough. You can rest." I smiled, because she didn't know. Rest had already begun inside me long ago. It just hadn't found its way to my heartbeat yet. I spent my last morning watching the sunlight move slowly across the floor. Every shadow it left behind seemed to bless something: the photos, the books, the empty chair. My son sat beside me, quiet, his strength trembling beneath love's weight. "I'll take care of her," he said, voice cracking like an oath. "I know," I whispered. "And she'll take care of you. That's how balance works." He nodded, and I could see both my husband and myself reflected in his eyes. When they helped me to the garden, the air smelled like home, soil, jasmine, and legacy. I touched the bark of the tree, feeling life pulsing beneath my fingertips. It wasn't goodbye, I said to it, but thank you. Thank you for growing where love was buried, for standing tall when we couldn't. The wind rustled the branches as if answering, "We remember." And in that whisper, I knew everything I'd built would remain alive long after I slept. That night, I wrote one final line in my journal, simple, unadorned, complete. Life is not about what we keep, it's about what we continue. Then I closed the book and placed it beside the first letter he'd ever written to me. The candle burned low, its flame steady as a heartbeat. As I closed my eyes, I wasn't leaving. I was simply going where love had gone before me. And somewhere beyond the window, the tree stood guard, keeping our promise. Years have passed since she left us, yet somehow her presence never did. The house still breathes her rhythm. Quiet mornings, humble dinners, laughter in moderation. The school stands taller now, its walls covered with drawings of hands holding hearts. Every child who learns there knows her story, though they only call her the woman who planted kindness. The tree she grew towers above the garden, shading generations with its patience. And when the wind passes through its branches, it whispers like her, calm, steady, eternal. I visit it often, bringing my own children, letting them run among its roots. They ask why it's so big, and I tell them, because it remembers every thank you. Sometimes I catch her daughter-in-law, now gray, graceful, still soft-spoken, sitting beneath it. She talks to the air as though someone listens, and maybe someone does. The bark bears initials carved long ago, now swallowed by growth but never erased. It feels alive, aware, a keeper of everything too sacred for words. Every spring, white blossoms return, falling like blessings on the soil she once touched. The petals cover the grass like snow, but warmer, softer, love in full bloom. Birds build nests there, and the village calls it the widow's tree. No one remembers exactly how the name began, only that it feels right. People leave small offerings at its base, a note, a coin, a flower, tokens of unseen prayers. It has become a place where sorrow turns into remembrance and remembrance into peace. The school holds an annual celebration each year beneath its branches. Children sing, elders tell stories, and someone always reads her husband's favorite poem. The sound of joy blends with the rustle of leaves, as if heaven and earth converse. When I close my eyes, I swear I can still hear her laughter carried by the wind. It doesn't echo like memory. It moves like presence. She never needed monuments. She had already become one. The house remains simple, no golden frames, no marble floors, only warmth. It's said that those who enter feel lighter, as though shedding burdens at the door. Maybe it's because kindness leaves residue, invisible but unshakable. Her portrait hangs in the hallway, smiling faintly, eyes alive with endless gentleness. Beside it, a quote carved into wood: "Love quietly. The world is always listening." That was her truth, her teaching, her eternity. And now, when the sun sets behind the hills, the tree catches the light like a flame that refuses to die. Its leaves shimmer gold before night folds them into sleep. From the window, the family watches, not mourning, but belonging. for they know she never left. She simply became everything she once tended. The soil, the wind, the laughter, the lesson, all of it her. And beneath that vast, forgiving sky, the tree stands tall, because love, truly, never forgets.